Welcome to NFT Sundays, a weekly conversation around art and technology, brought to you by DMINTI and the Museum of Crypto Art. All right, everybody, welcome to our latest episode of NFT Sundays. My name is Colborn, the Museum of Crypto Art, and I'm joined today by legendary guest Mathew Dryhurst. Matt, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. We'll start this one as we do all of these shows and just ask you to share a bit about yourself, let everybody know who you are and how you came to be in this.
So I'm Matt. I spend most of my time working on artworks. I run an art studio with my wife and creative partner Holly Herndon here in Berlin. And outside of that, I'm starting a company right now. I'm involved in, I've been involved in the Web3 crypto space for 7 or so years, something like that. So spend the rest of my time contributing to projects, and also publishing our research through the Interdependence Podcast.
So not a busy guy at all.
I'm really busy. I have no personality outside of things I contribute to, which is a problem, but it's how I am.
Right. So tell us more, please, about the Interdependence Podcast. I've heard from multiple people and listened to it myself avidly. This is really, really good stuff that you're doing. So I'd love for you to share more information on that.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, for Holly and I, we have maybe an atypical art practice in so much as it's heavily research focused. So, for example, we will take a couple of years to research a topic, develop some tools, right? Like the last record we released in 2019, we developed like a whole custom singing neural network system for the record, and then we'll take that on tour. When you see the artwork, it's kind of like that's one piece of the puzzle. But then if you want to go down the rabbit hole, there's a lot there. And so over the pandemic, we were like, we've been thinking about it for some time. We're like, it'd be really cool to, in that research process, we encounter so many people and so many interesting ideas. These are people we will be speaking to anyway, so it's kind of fun to record that and share that with people, right? Because if you are interested, whether it's our practice or you're just interested in these topics generally, those conversations may have value, right? And so the way we frame it is we're optimistic about the 21st century, which is not necessarily, it seems almost like wrong to say that or something. But generally speaking, like beyond like it being like a critical podcast in the sense where we do tackle kind of high level topics. Ultimately, we're interested in speaking to people who are building stuff, who are doing things about maybe issues that they care about. And for us, it's like a great source of inspiration too, because we get to talk to lots of amazing people who are trying to build stuff. That's really the focus.
And I'd say in a space that is so flooded with perhaps like intentional misinformation, a lot of hype, you maintain an incredible objective neutrality.
Thank you.
And I would imagine this comes from a heavily research practice and fact-based approach, and it's just so necessary.
Totally. Well, the thing is, ultimately, a lot of it comes down to credibility, right? I will say we definitely have some skin in the game, right? When we're talking about some of these topics, whether it be crypto or AI stuff, quite clearly we're very interested in them, right? So it's not like we're coming at it from an outside perspective. And oftentimes we'll have guests on who are friends or collaborators. But ultimately, as you'll know, right? Like fundamentally, our main kind of existence in the world is as artists, right? Like we live or die by our reputations. I have every intention of pursuing legitimate critiques of crypto, but I want good information. And I think that's the thing that frustrates me, and that's kind of the middle ground that needs to come to. So I'll give a great example, right? Like we had I think a really successful episode with Carl McDonald, the artist and researcher, who is a crypto skeptic. About his research on Ethereum energy numbers, right? And it turned into a rather heated debate. But by the end of it, I was so happy to talk to him because he did as much work as anybody to get to the bottom of it, right? And then once you actually have those numbers, then you can make personal decisions about how you feel about it. And so that's the role I really see us playing in some ways, is I want to give people good information to come to their own conclusions about things. And ultimately that, we need to find the best information because I don't want to be perceived. I mean, when you deal with any of these kind of bleeding edge technical topics, for better or worse, the immediate perception is that you're somehow trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, right? That's the burden that all of us live under. And so it's kind of behooves us, and it's in our interests actually to try and seek out good information and different perspectives. There are some things I won't entertain.
Go on.
Yeah. No, just it's become kind of fashionable, I think, to really straw man certain topics.
Yeah.
And we've received some criticism from some corners that we aren't entertaining some of those people. But that's kind of where I draw a line, is I don't really want to participate in sensationalist kind of online politics or just talk to people because they get a lot of retweets for saying silly things, you know? It's really about finding that middle ground of people who are, legitimately critical or legitimately supportive of something, but I believe we can trust them. That's kind of where I'm at.
I'd say, one of the great things about the crypto community is, of course, this free thinking ability and open-mindedness to approach different topics from various angles. I read a great tweet, I don't remember who, from somebody yesterday saying a lot of this cognitive dissonance is born of these echo chambers in which we participate and kind of how the algorithm feeds us the information that we want to see. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, how the algorithm is conditioning us to be the people that we were yesterday instead of the people that we collectively can be. So going back to kind of the optimistic approach, can you expound on, the values that you first found interesting in crypto, and then how that relates to the building of Web3 communities?
Totally. I think you hit the nail on the head there. You don't want to be too binary about these things, but I think, there are echo chambers. The way in which we receive information and we're incentivized to publish information is, like the most extreme arguments or the most extreme feelings or sentiments seem to travel further. I actually published a piece today, and I was tired, and there was one sentence where I was like, I'm just going to say something shitty here. And clearly, it works, right? And so you're constantly having to battle with yourself. I have to constantly kind of battle with myself to not take that kind of severe approach, even though we're all susceptible to doing it sometimes. And really it comes down to it's a glass half full, glass half empty thing, right? I don't believe that I have all the answers. I'm not zealous necessarily. But at the same time, I'm also pretty confident that if you actually want to make a material difference to the field that you participate in, or for people that you care about, it doesn't really do that much to be permanently negative. That you can, on places like Twitter or whatever, gather large audiences doing that, but functionally, So anyway, for me, I mean, I came into crypto initially, let's say from 2013 or something. I got particularly interested in writing and researching, let's say, critiques of the platform economy. I think I was quite early to that, to be honest. I don't think there were too many people leveling critiques at Spotify, for example, before I was doing that. This was in my promo-negative days, so I speak with some experience. Right. From there, got particularly interested. At the time, there was, a movement in San Francisco called the Indie Web. There were there's a field called the Fediverse, this idea of saying, well, what would it mean to decentralize these tools? So rather than having one central mandate determining how your music is distributed or whatever, what would it mean to decentralize those things? And so I got very interested in those ideas and worked on, from 2014, released in 2015, a decentralized publishing framework called Saga. And one of the things about Saga, long story short, basically, the idea was it was a self-hosted piece of software that you would host on your server. it would let you distribute work, so artworks in this embed across the web. And then what would happen is you would have discrete control of every version of that piece of art online. So unlike posting it to YouTube, which is a centralized service where you can take it down for everybody or you can keep it up for everybody, with Saga, the idea was if Nike posted my artwork in this location, I could take it down there. Or I could, right?
Yeah.
And so what I was working with at the time was being like, wouldn't it be cool if under that system where you could alter the work in real time for different people in different contexts? I mean, at the time I called website-specific performance. What if you could write rules that determined how your artwork would react in those circumstances? And so that was kind of like the big idea, like what would rules be in a system like that? And so it ended up getting published. It got some press or whatever. And then I got some people write me. This was I'd say like early summer 2015, something like that. And be like, well, have you heard of Ethereum? Because what you're describing with attributing a rule set to distributing media sounds a lot like a smart contract. And I didn't know what a smart contract was. So from there, I kind of fell down the rabbit hole. At the time, this was pre-launch Ethereum. Read the white paper, was like, okay, look, like some of the embers I was playing with, there's some people over here who seem to be quite honestly way more technically competent than I am. They see some promise in this. So from there, just, I can't stress enough, you perhaps know, but many people don't, that going back to around about that period of time, on number one, on the optimistic side, this was very much a group of pretty optimistic nerds, right? Distinct from the Bitcoin community and the associations with that, even though I don't mind the Bitcoin community, but the Ethereum community generally, it was like nerds tinkering on things and coming up with really big ideas, incredibly idealistic. And so I found that very intoxicating. Over the years, honestly was kind of kept involved largely down to many of the characters involved because, as you'll know from art and music, I mean, my personal opinion was that this was the most exciting game in town because the rate of new ideas I was encountering from people working on systems, albeit with Ethereum or maybe other systems that came later, it was just so stimulating. I was like, wow, like finally there's this whole group of people who are tinkering and in some cases, having really, really big ideas about what the future of media could be, how media could be fairer, how, people could be compensated better, So I fell down this rabbit hole. And of course, fast forward to, let's say, 2019, 2020, all of a sudden the rest of the world started really caring about it, And so it's a bit strange in a sense too, to also kind of inherit the perspectives, or inherit, an association in a way with a lot of the work that has come from in the past couple of years, right? And so even there, I find I can see clear divisions where it's like there's corners of crypto I'm super fascinated by, and I still consider a big part of my community, and then there's corners that are totally alien to me. Even though I might find some parts of it interesting, So that's kind of that's kind of where I fall on it, is that ultimately, crypto isn't any one thing. Ethereum isn't any one thing. One of the benefits of a permissionless network and pitfalls of a permissionless network is there's no one to tell someone you don't like to not do something.
Right.
So I definitely fall on the kind of wide-eyed, optimistic side of that spectrum.
I completely concur. I think it brings out the best and the worst of human nature in its extremes. And it is emotionally incredible roller coaster, given its 24/7 nature, given its global access, its immutability and uncensorability. Maybe we can speak more. I'm curious on two parts. Kind of what is your perhaps like utopian vision of the technology, and where have NFTs shown incredible promise to you? And where have we begun to identify kind of pitfalls in what we've created?
Awesome. Yeah. Well, for me, I think the main principle and one of my kind of like foundational principles why I was critical, for example, of a Spotify way back when, is that fundamentally I wouldn't characterize it as utopian, but I would say fundamentally it's kind of my belief system that no one vision ought to determine the opportunities available to artists, right? So like, I was just in Singapore playing a show and met a bunch of artists there. I may have ideas about tools that could be made or be purposed in that context, but I don't think it's on me, and I don't think any idea I can have is going to be a perfect fit, right? A perfect fit for their context in Singapore or place X, right? And so, in a sense, my hope for crypto and these kind of decentralized networks is, in a sense, kind of an anti-utopian principle, which is I want tools to be made available for everybody rather than kind of like a one-size-fits-all system to be able to tailor a suit that fits their context.
Right.
And so in a way, it's a very optimistic vision, but it's not one single vision. And I think that's what gives me spirit, is that, you know, if I look at going backwards to like, you know, the early 2010s and seeing the available options where it's like, look, like you got a SoundCloud account or a Tumblr or you're on Spotify or whatever. It was like very, very limited. And now looking at the new infrastructure that's being built partly, largely by people in crypto, I'm like, there are, you know, now it's like there's 20 options. Because when we say NFT, what does that really mean, right? NFT is a file type.
Yeah.
There are NFTs that exist in collector contexts, right? One of ones. There are NFTs that exist in these kind of gamed like contexts. There are NFTs that exist as in a membership context, right? So I could probably identify 20 to 30 different ways that people are experimenting with making a living with this file type. And fundamentally, what I think is really cool about it is that there's no universal decree outside of using the file type as to how you value your art, right? And so giving that programmability to artists or communities or whatever, for me, that's a very optimistic. That's very optimistic. Now on the pitfalls, I think being optimistic about it, I think that we've become so used to in a Web 2 context, or let's say in an earlier industrial context, right? Like you release a record, this is how it comes out. Yeah. Into thinking that everybody fits a standard in how they ought to approach things, that I think some of that thinking has bled over into the way people are initially encountering crypto and Web3. And I'll be honest, a lot of boosters in Web3 don't help with this.
Yeah.
Because when most people hear an NFT, they think of a Bored Ape, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think Bored Apes are quite interesting, or the PFP is quite interesting as a form. But when most people think about it now, they think of a very specific kind of digital collectible that is scarce in a 10,000 collection or whatever, that, you know, that can be pumped and dumped. And I find these applications of it interesting, but I do think that is a danger in a way, that when the narrative goes from what I recall it being years ago of saying, wow, we're decentralizing, right? We are exploding the potential of this internet, and we're going to add all these primitives that let people, you know, construct their own universe. When that collapses into, oh no, like an NFT is a digital collectible that you can have on your Instagram account or your Spotify account, and, you know, big whoop, right? Like when it gets collapsed into, not that I find that disinteresting necessarily, but it's a very collapsed vision. And so you can almost get to the point whereby a lot of kind of like people who are arguing against NFTs, I almost end up agreeing with them, because I'm like, in your perception of what an NFT is and what the utility of these things is, I kind of agree that it's limited. So in some ways, you know, in compressing or like condensing it down to meet demand for like, you know, a simple description of what Web3 means or what crypto means, you can also kind of turn people off being interested in it. And so I think that's a real danger, right? And that's kind of like a challenge that, putting my optimistic hat on, I think over time people respond to art, and over time people respond to dynamism, and over time people will find all the interesting corners of things that are happening in crypto, and that's where I want to be. But I think, you know, it just takes a while. It takes a while.
There's a lot to unpack there. Let me see if I can synthesize something. from it. I think crypto is inherently born of a CCO and kind of remix movement. There is certainly copy-paste culture within it throughout, right? Dogecoin,
Yeah,
Litecoin
totally.
being forks of Bitcoin, Tron being an 80% copy-pasted white paper of Ethereum. And nowadays we're talking about, multi-billion-dollar protocols that serve effectively what means, the promise of value transfer on the internet, but really kind of mimetic and pump and dump. And I think, what NFTs did mirrored a lot of what happened in 2017, 18 with the ICO boom, except we were able to attach, right, this visual language to it. And in the society that we're moving towards, global society, it's those visuals, it's those symbols that really attract attention. I think likewise, Bored Ape Yacht Club is fascinating for what they were able to socially engineer.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's nuts. Honestly, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's wildly impressive. We've seen things pop out of nothing that have received tremendous support. I think back to Constitution DAO, and I think recently to this thing, for the culture, where people were paid 0.01 ETH to mint it, hundreds of thousands of followers overnight. It extends into DeFi, right, where everybody is yield chasing the new protocol. It becomes a bit of this shell game, very pyramid in nature, but the rapid iteration is incredibly impressive. The pace of innovation, the rise and fall, the free movement of capital, and extending this into metaverse environments, digital environments, what I call, global digital villages. This was always kind of the promise of the internet to me. It is all incredibly exciting. And when I have conversations like this, I'm always just reinvigorated as to the possibilities of what can be. So I don't really have a question, but I imagine we feel similarly.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I'm kind of the same, and I think, and that's it. I mean, given what you've just said, again, to newcomers to the space, there's almost nothing you can point out that I'll get squeamish over because of the ICO boom, right? Because of those years, I'm like, oh yeah, scams. I'm like, that's not a scam. Like, I'll show you a scam, right? There's like, so once you've kind of got over that part, I agree. And then, but in aggregate, absolutely, that's the thing. Is like in aggregate, there are all these kind of strange kinks, like strange new things that come out of this kind of rapid breakneck pace of kind of speculation and accumulation, and you're like, yeah, it's I was talking to someone the other day on the podcast actually about this, and I'm like, I can't think of quite a term for it, but it's like, it's almost like in a sense there's been a new entertainment medium born of this, where it's kind of like the medium of participation in this kind of like 24-hour swarm online. I can't think of an analog to it. Fandom gets a little bit close, but it's kind of like birthing these odd moments online, where in some ways it's kind of like, yeah, of course there's money involved and there's scams involved and there's people losing money and gambling and whatever, but like somewhere in there's something new where I'm like, this is a participatory performance somehow. It's like, and it's not going away. And so I think, yeah, it's like, and after all of these crazy phrases, you're totally correct. I think, there was the ICO boom, let's just call it, right? Like the first utility of these ledgers and tokens was speculation in markets, right?
Right.
So it made sense that the first crazy spike would be a fever around speculation, i.e. the ICO boom, right? And then that disappeared. Some of those organizations meant what they were what they said, and then some didn't. And I recall all of the ones that didn't. Yeah. And I hope that reputation sticks with them. But then the next question is around, the NFT. That was the next available kind of, spark of being like, well, to be honest, my opinion, I mean, NFTs, colored coins, this idea has been around for a while, but like the ability to all of a sudden, tie that tie this non-fungible token to an image on a database or an image on chain, and be able to just distribute these things, speculate on them, whatever, was like the next available thing that you could do with some sophistication.
Yeah.
And so it makes kind of sense that that would be a crazy boom. And we'll see, from that, we'll see some things stick around. Some of these concepts are not going away, and a lot of stuff just completely disappear. But that's normal, But the rapid iteration of these cycles, I agree. It is invigorating, and it's also telling to me that ultimately the things that endure kind of warranted. It really is there's a kind of survival of the fittest conceptually in some ways, where it's like, yeah.
It's like Darwin capitalism at its finest.
It's brutal.
It's really brutal. But I think what you're describing, and I've noticed, is how these circles of adoption occur, and it starts generally with a group of idealistic, highly motivated, frankly, like nerds and intellectuals, and dreaming of possibilities of what could be, and designing systems that have vast untapped potential, and letting a user base find that potential. Of course, because we're creating new value, we're creating money, the first circle of adopters is going to be capital.
Totally.
So, in my mind, what I was thinking in 2017 is that there has to be an even distribution of genius in the world, right? Mm-hmm. There has to be people locally on the ground solving problems that fit their community, and broader communities at large, and these should be rewarded outside of a kind of Silicon Valley focused VC type of model. Then to invite in, more creative thinkers, more artists, telling people that what they're doing is art, and valuing creativity and culture of this movement is the next natural pairing of that. I think putting the tools of crypto in the hands of artists is important, because quite frankly, they are used to more volatility in their lives. They're used to coming up with creative solutions to problems that they face every day, and they're not so ingrained in a sense of stability. So I kind of want to use this opportunity to segue into some of the work that you're doing with Context. Yeah, and
so Context is an organization that they're very close friends, but I don't actually work with them.
Okay, and Channel then?
Yeah, so Channel's an idea. It's kind of one of these things, like a lot of the projects that we're working on at the moment are ideas that have been around for a while that we've wanted to work on, but it was only really the past couple of years, again, in the kind of, in the shade of all the NFT craze, all of a sudden a bunch of infrastructure was released that allowed things to happen. And so Channel is a project that we put together with a group of collaborators. So Holly and I with the Interdependence Podcast, Joshua Citarella, who does Do Not Research in New York, New Models, who do an amazing podcast and run a community here in Berlin, and basically a bunch of friends. We were like, okay, what would it look like to build some kind of a support infrastructure for a different kind of media organization, where, for example, one of the things we've identified is like not dissimilar to what I was describing earlier about this kind of vast online performance. One of the things that seems native to Web3 is this idea of kind of like bottom-up generative communities versus kind of like top-down media, where, like your Patreons and your Substack, it's like, you have someone often who's like defected from the New York Times, often who's deciding to write about like the culture wars, is pretty much always the case. Right. Defects from the New York Times, starts a newsletter, and then people comment, right? And it's like, okay, that's a forum. A different forum, which Josh, New Models, we've also explored, is this idea of saying, well, we're actually kind of incubating a group of people who are all interested in a particular topic and are all creating things. So, for example, like Josh's Do Not Research, they just had a large exhibition where I think it was like 60 pieces of artwork that all came from the Discord were exhibited in this exhibition. New Models last year published a book with like 50 Discord contributors. It's this amazing book called the New Models Codex. Holly and I with Holly Plus, which I'll also talk about, just released 70 releases made by the Holly Plus community using her voice. And so it's like whatever that is, Julian from New Models calls it a generative adversarial media network, but like whatever that is, Channel is basically designed to try and build tools for that, as opposed to, let's say, a Patreon or a Substack. So that's great. I mean, I contribute in so much as I advise with Channel, and obviously the podcast is a big part of it as a founding member. But that organization is growing, and I believe we'll soon have a space in New York.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I think it's great. But really with this intention of kind of incubating bottom-up networks, which I think is a coordination tool, a coordination task that feels very relevant to the kind of things that we're seeing in crypto exclusively.
I'd be remiss not to shout out the Loot project, right?
Hell yeah.
And this creation from Metafactory that's on my head. That was incredibly innovative, and just to give, and really it also questioned kind of like the form of the substance, to have something that was so open and ambiguous, and then really just turn it over to the community to kind of come together and create whatever it is. And I think that
Exactly.
open-endedness, that invitation to participate is incredibly compelling. In many ways, I feel overwhelmed by the amount of communities that I'm in and trying to participate in all and lend a voice. But I think, again, over time, this idea of kind of survival of the fittest and really figuring out where your voice can contribute best is interesting. So I'd love, go ahead.
No, I agree. I mean, that's, this is where my bias shows. I think that idea is the one that will win.
Yeah.
Because I think ultimately it's like anything. It's like the CCO philosophy, this idea of permissive IP. A friend of mine, JMO, calls it that. This is very much the approach we're taking with Holly Plus. I think it wins because it ultimately it makes no sense to arbitrarily limit the amount of stuff that people can do with ideas that you come up with,
right.
And particularly if you can put mechanisms in place to attribute or remunerate where appropriate. That is such a powerful idea, and it's one of the ideas where unambiguously I think that's an idea that is really worth putting a lot of belief into. I've no doubt that in 10, 15 years that we'll look back and some of it will seem naive, but to me it just feels like a fundamentally good idea. And with Holly, I mean, that's the most recent project that's actually kind of taking up the majority of my time right now. We started a project called Holly Plus, which is basically in many ways applying a lot of these kind of CC0 permissive principles to the field of machine learning. So for years we've been kind of talking about issues with remuneration, issues with confusion, let's say, around, quote unquote, deep fakes. And so Holly, through her doctoral research and some of the work we've been doing, came up with a different approach. And so the basic idea is being like, no, like, what would it mean if rather than trying to foreclose the opportunity for people to work with your digital likeness, let's say your voice or your face, you instead ran toward it. And saw it as an opportunity to instead kind of encourage people to be creative. And so in those circumstances, we characterize IP as identity play, right? So rather than seeing it as something that you restrict people from using, you actually encourage. And so what we've been doing over the past year or two is basically creating instruments that allow for anybody to create work with Holly, as Holly. And see it very, very much in line with this kind of Loot nouns spirit of like not wanting to arbitrarily cap what people can do with stuff. And I'm completely with you. For me, that as well as projects like Songcamp, which they're minting today. We recently had The Fringe, which is a sci-fi franchise that's being built using some of these tools and principles on the podcast. That for me is exactly where it's at. Like in 10 years time, I think when you look back, that will be the explosion. This is kind of like, it's like open source, mutated, all these earlier principles that were good ideas, but were a little naive and fell a little short. All those ideas mutated into something way more generative and ultimately perhaps maybe more fair. So we're totally in agreement, and I'm jealous of your hat.
Yeah, I like this one a lot. I'll say it's frankly, I think it's probably a terrifying notion for many. I think most people in this space race toward privacy. I remember, when I was starting my collector's journey, privacy was the default. There are very, very few public-facing collectors of this. So to take it to the extreme, to turn over your physical identity, which is really like the one thing that you can control, to the world is, I'm curious perhaps maybe of any insight you could share in that journey of kind of like giving up that control, and if there is, I imagine there is a like reflexive conversation with the identity that people are creating on your behalf and you as a person.
Totally, you're totally right. I mean, 2 points there. I will say. I mean, I'm definitely speaking for Holly here, but we've had this conversation a lot. Like, first off, when you are somewhat of a public figure. I mean, I'm like a public-facing figure, but I'm not a public figure, right? Like,
right.
My wife is a little bit, right? Like, if you query the OpenAI clip data set, it knows who Holly is, right? Yeah. So you cross over into a dimension where a lot of people feel like they know you without knowing you. These kind of parasocial relationships, right? Like, so to some extent, when you make that call to exist in the public sphere, you are already, in some ways, people are already being creative with you, maybe just not explicitly. And so I think that in some senses, it's not actually as jarring as it might initially appear. However, using tools like cryptographic identities, like public cryptographic identities, one of the cool things that we put forward with Holly Plus is obviously, so long story short, basically there's a Holly Plus DAO, token holders they receive suggestions of works made as Holly, and they get to approve or deny them. And so the idea is that because they hold a stake in the identity, they don't want to approve anything that is inappropriate, right? And so as a result of that, if now Holly's like made her identity open and usable for anybody permissively, if there's something out there that's heinous, you would look and say, okay, well, has this been approved by the DAO or not? If not, don't take it seriously. This clearly is something that isn't coming from this hive mind that stewards and governs this identity. In my mind, that solves the deepfake problem. I'm making it sound simple because there's all kind of stuff that needs to be put in place, but on principle, that kind of assuages some of those fears. To the point about privacy, though, as you'll know, right, like there's a lot of people who decide to be in the public eye, but pseudonymously, right? I mean, a burial as an example, or any number of people on crypto Twitter, right? And there's also nothing to say that, let's say, the assets or the identity that is spawned from that person, right? The person that they choose to be in the public eye, right? You might choose to have 3 heads and be purple and whatever. If that is unique enough to you that it is distinguishable, then you could also take this approach, right? So there's nothing to say, I would say, that we're not necessarily advocating that everybody dox themselves or everybody exists in the way that, let's say, Holly has done. But I think the principle is still useful in that sense, right? And the closest analog that you could see, for example, is looking at someone like a Michaela, right? Like Michaela's Lil Michaela's an avatar. You could see the same principles apply there, where people are encouraged to make work as Michaela or with Michaela. but there being some way of formally verifying that, you know, the most heinous sections of society don't get to pretend that that it's an official usage. But it is very strange. It is all very strange. I mean, we have an instrument now where I can sing as Holly in real time. It's strange.
My only counter to that and question for you is, do you believe that governance systems will be nimble enough to effectively kind of manage this should it continue to receive more and more adoption and use?
It's a great question, and we'll see. I think that fundamentally, you know, if you have the fallback, right, like if right now people are prepared to wait, you know, 10 minutes for a transaction to go through or something, the analog here would be assume something is fake until it's verified. Right, and so I think there's all kind of other things that likely will come in future, right? Like the idea being that, you know, your wallet or your cryptographic identity could be broadcast from as being like a clear way to understand that this is a verified person. But you're not wrong to raise that. I mean, I think a lot of that needs to be figured out. Our approach really is just saying that it's coming. It's not, you know, it's not kind of like a far-flung science fiction scenario. These tools are very, very good, and this is the stuff we're seeing. You know, on a research level, this stuff is very, very good, and no effort really has been made to resolve what this means for the artists or for the public. And so that's where the research gets really interesting.
Yeah, I have to say it's endlessly fascinating. Had a conversation with a wonderful artist yesterday, Federico Somai, like going back to that moment when he first got Grand Theft Auto and the immersion into that character. So I believe that it does become kind of a MMORPG around somebody's physical identity. Which I find fascinating. And then, you know, the second point is at the museum, we're also working to build a virtual curator. So that so that somebody can come in and talk to the painting as if they were talking to the artist themselves, and how to weight voice and how to weight input around that, and what it kind of takes from the artist or how it gives to the artist is just a monster question. And, you know, only the logic is done. I've seen it work. It creates like tremendous reviews of work. It tells wonderful, fabulous history. It makes all sorts of like brilliant comparisons based on this like initial data set that we've compiled. So that's
good to hear.
Yeah, it's just a lot of fun, and we have some brilliant people working on it.
And that comes down to the point of it, right? Is it's like, again, like crypto, like the next. I mean, I was tweeting about this, like new culture war just dropped, right? Like DALL-E came out, and it's like that'll be the next big one because it's got all the hallmarks. And again, you know, there are the existential risks, like singularity maxis in AI that I find sometimes very entertaining, sometimes very smart, but sometimes also kind of hyperbolic. That depends on who you're talking about. And then you have the, you know, let's burn it all, kind of like Malthusian. The Malthusian impulse kicks in again, where it's like, no, all of a sudden, you know, like the, and what you're doing, I think, is exactly the right approach, right? It's like, no, like come to your conclusions, tinker, build it. Yeah. I have no doubt, like. This curator recommendation system that you're mentioning, like no one's going to confuse it for someone who's dedicated 20 years of their life to that field, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have utility, and that also doesn't mean it's not going to be like really useful and really consequential. And that's kind of our position with AI music or art or something like this, is it's like on either side of the spectrum, I can be kind of alienated by conclusions. These are the ones that tend to get the biggest amount of attention. But, you know, AI doesn't need to be sentient to have a massive impact on the economy, and actually somewhere in that middle is you get closer to the truth, and it's also just fun because, you know, there's so much you can do. There's actually so much more you can do with these tools, and invariably 5-10 years they will be standard. I have no doubt.
Well, I hate to do it. I think we could probably talk endlessly, but we have to close it here. So I'd love for you any closing words, and please let people know where to find you and connect if that's something you wish.
Well, really happy to meet you. Happy to learn of the work you're doing and the AI AI curator. Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Matt Dryhurst, MATDRYHURST. You can listen to Interdependence at interdependence.fm. And that's about it. But it's been really fun. I'm glad to meet your acquaintance.
Yeah, likewise. Super pleasure. I'll sign off here. Colborn Bell with the Museum of Crypto Art. We were here with Matt Dryhurst. Thank you for the incredible conversation, and DMINTI for putting this all together.
Cheers.